If y'all see pom-poms, those are my students in the corner squealing. Yeah. Can you hear me? Oh, here we go with the mic again. It is my deepest delight to share with you one of my favorite people, and I think the woman who has taught me not only how to be a poet, but what it means to be a poet and to live as a poet. As Kate mentioned, I got to study with Natasha for 4 years. From the introduction to poetry class I begged, cheated, maybe even stole my way into through a year of writing poems with her as a senior, wrote a collection. And it has been the most amazing journey with her. And before I get to the Wikipedia entry about her, I just want to tell you a little story. Because Natasha is actually the woman who taught me the word empathy. I had never heard the word empathy till I entered her class. And not only did she give me the dictionary definition of empathy, but she has lived the definition of empathy for me. And to not make her totally cry, I'm going to share one small story. We were in New Orleans last year at a conference where she was the keynote and I was giving a graduate panel, read some poems. And afterwards, we had gone out and went to lunch and the Napoleon House, I believe, where we entered. And she said, "Oh, my father brought me here as a child." Paused and went, "That's a strange place for a father to take a daughter." But we went in and we sat down at this table, communal table, and looked over. And I made eye contact with the people next to me, and they were the other grad students who had been on this panel with me. And they looked at me and nodded, and then they looked at Natasha. And their eyes got wide and big, and they kind of stepped back. And they went, "Oh my God, you're Natasha Trethewey!" And she went, and she was so gracious and said, "Yes, who are you?" "Oh, you're on," and she invited them to join us and have drinks and lunch, and we had a beautiful conversation about all the places poetry lives in, not only our lives as poets, but the people who send us poems, who ask us to read, who stand up and recite poems to us. When you say you're a poet, someone will inevitably say, "Oh, I'm a poet too," or start reciting something that they learned as a kindergartner. And it's just amazing how people are still affected by this every day, not just those of us who have degrees. So this is just one example of the deep generosity Natasha has for not just poetry, but people in general. And she brings that through every poem she writes, every speaking engagement she gives, and her entire life. And it is my deep pleasure to share her with you. The Wikipedia entry, for those of you who are not familiar with this wonderful woman and who are about to be just absolutely captivated, Natasha was born on the 100th anniversary of Confederate Memorial Day in Gulfport, Mississippi. You can't even make that stuff up. Since her father was white and her mother was black, their marriage was illegal in the South and had to cross into Cincinnati to get married. She grew up between Atlanta and the Gulf Coast, received her BA from UGA, an MA in English from Hollins, and an MFA from UMass Amherst. Her books include Domestic Work, which won the 1999 inaugural Cave Canem Prize, selected by Rita Dove. The book explores her grandmother's life as a domestic in the South. Her second collection, Belloc's Ophelia, centers around ekphrastic poetry about Belloc's photographs, especially the life of Ophelia, a black prostitute in the early 1900s who is so fair she can pass for a white woman. Her third collection, Native Guard, won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize. It details her public history growing up in the still segregated South and her mother's tragic death, and intersects with the public history of race and the Civil War. Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast is a nonfiction work illustrating resilience of the Gulf Coast and is specifically focused on Gulfport. She details not only race but class divides and concerns through the narrative of her brother, who turned to illegal activity in desperation after the catastrophe. Thrall, her fourth book of poetry, is a companion piece to Native Guard, turning to focus on her father and the other half of her lineage. Trethewey's many honors and awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute, where she was a Bunting Fellow, She has held appointments at Duke University, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Yale University. She served 2 terms as Poet Laureate of the United States from 2012 to 2014. She's currently the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of English and Creative Writing and Director of Creative Writing at Emory University, and it is now my deep, deep pleasure to introduce Natasha Trethewey.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here with Alicia and with some old friends, Kate and Tony, and some new friends, Rick, and all of you here tonight, and particularly some of the graduate students and the prospective students I got to talk with today. It's been a great day, and so I thank you all for coming and for finding your way here after a couple of changes I understand happened. Some of you who were in the room a little while ago probably saw some other kind people I like to thank who were helping me figure out the lighting. We were trying to figure out, how to get this on, how to get that dark, how to get sound that would be great. And I just have to tell you, there was a sign out there that said Natasha Trethewey, Poet Laureate. I'm not the Poet Laureate anymore. Charles Wright is. And when you're not the Poet Laureate anymore, you really fall hard because when I gave readings at the Library of Congress, just so you know, in case you haven't been there, all the people who introduce you have to walk up this stairway onto the stage, where you give a reading. But then when they announce your name, all of a sudden some doors open in the back, kind of like The Price is Right. And I'm just standing there like this, and then I walk out, and you hear this audible gasp from the audience. I get to leave that way, too. It's kind of magical. You can see how my life has changed. But it's better this way, actually. And so, again, I thank you for being here. I feel even more comfortable coming here. As Rick said, it's a place of friends. And so I feel comfortable. I said this to the people that I met with earlier today, that I had this wild hair when I was driving up here, that I would read from a few of my books with a particular theme that I thought might link some of the poems together. When you have a new book out, you tend to read mostly from that book because your publisher wants you to sell that book. And so for the last couple of years, I've been reading from my newest book only, Thrall. So tonight, it's fun for me to try to think of another way to give a reading. And so I thought that I would read from 3 of my collections. One of the things that always influences me, something I feel dedicated to as a poet, is the intersection between public history and personal history. And all of the poems I write seem to grow out of a concern with those intersections as well as the contentions between personal history and public history, often what is written and then sometimes what is left out or erased from the historical record. And I tend to do that in a couple of different ways, 3 different ways in particular. One, through ekphrasis, through writing about art, photographs, paintings, also through persona poems, and through the elegy. So tonight, I'm going to start with some poems from my collection, Belloc's Ophelia, that I've not read from for a long time. This is a book that's kind of my... to use a term that I hope is not too unfair, but you know the term. I'll use some other racial terms later on in the same way. The redhead stepchild of my collections. It's the smaller one. It's my husband's favorite, but it's also one that I think people know less about. Alicia mentioned it. It's a book that is about the photographs of E.J. Belloc, who was in 1910 to 1912, photographed women in the red light district of New Orleans, the district called Storyville. His photographs are amazing. They were found by Lee Friedlander, and MoMA first published a museum catalog about them and showed the photographs in the 70s and re-released them again in the 90s. These were haunting images to me, particularly because based on the wallpaper that you could find in some of the backdrops of these photographs, you could identify the fact that which houses these were in, like the house of Lula White or the house of Countess Piazza. Both of these were octoroon or mulatto madams. So these would have been women with very white skin who would have been designated in the blue books that sailors received when they got off of ships as octoroon, but they were prized for their white skin and their dark interior. This is the imagined diary I'm going to read of one of the women who lived there. But before that, the opening poem to the whole collection. When I first saw one of these photographs as a graduate student, I was immediately reminded of the cover of my 9th grade Hamlet text. It was a painting by the pre-Raphaelite painter John Everett Millay that reminded me so much, Ophelia in the Brook. It reminded me so much of this other painting I was seeing. And of course the ekphrasis goes beyond simply looking at a painting and a photograph and comparing it, but also to literature, to Hamlet's Ophelia. I knew even then what "get thee to a nunnery" meant. Belloc's Ophelia, from a photograph circa 1912. In Millay's painting, Ophelia dies face up, eyes and mouth open as if caught in the gasp of her last word or breath, flowers and reeds growing out of the pond, floating on the surface around her. The young woman who posed lay in a bath for hours, shivering, catching cold, perhaps imagining fish tangling in her hair or nibbling a dark mole raised upon her white skin. Ophelia's final gaze aims skyward, her palms curling open as if she's just said, "Take me." I think of her when I see Belloc's photograph, a woman posed on a wicker divan, her hair spilling over. Around her, flowers, on a pillow, on a thick carpet. Even the ravages of this old photograph bloom like water lilies across her thigh. How long did she hold there, this other Ophelia, nameless inmate in Storyville, naked, her nipples offered up hard with cold? The small mound of her belly, the pale hair of her pubis, these things, her body, there for the taking. But in her face, a dare. Staring into the camera, she seems to pull all movement from her slender limbs and hold it in her heavy-lidded eyes. Her body limp as dead Ophelia's, her lips poised to open, to speak. While she's in the brothel that couple of years of her life, she writes a few letters back home to a school teacher that she loved. And I'm going to read just one of those letters before moving on to her diary. This is Letter from Storyville, December 1910. My dearest Constance, I am not out of doors as you feared, and though I've had to tuck the blue wool suit you gave me, I do now have plenty to eat. I have no doubt my decision will cause you much distress, but still I must tell you, when I had grown too weary to keep up my inquiries and my rent was coming due, I had what must be considered the good fortune to meet Countess P., an elegant businesswoman who offered me a place in her house. I did not accept then, though I had tea with her, the first I'd had in days. And later, too hungry to reason, I spent the last of my purse on a good meal. It was to her that I went when I had to leave my hotel, and I am as yet adjusting to my new life. This first week I sat as required each evening in the parlor, unnoticed, the professor working the piano into a frenzy, a single cockroach scaling the flocked velvet wallpaper. The men who've come have called only on the girls they know, their laughter trailing off behind them, their gowns floating past the balustrade. Though she said nothing, Countess is indeed sympathetic. Just the other night, She introduced me to a longtime client, hoping that he'd take a liking to me. I was too shy to speak and only pretended to sip the wine he'd ordered. Of course, he found me dull and soon excused himself to find another girl. Part of me was quite relieved, though I knew I could not earn a living that way. And so, last night, I was auctioned as a newcomer to the house, as yet untouched, though Countess knows well the thing from which I've run. Many of the girls do too, and some of them even speak of a child they left behind. The auction was a near quiet affair, much like the one Whitman described. The men, some wealthy gentlemen from out of town. Countess announced that I recite poetry, hinting at a more dignified birth and thus a tragic occasion for my arrival at her house. She calls me Violet now, a common name here in Storyville, except that I am the African violet, for the promise of that wild continent hidden beneath my white skin. At her cue, I walked slowly across the room, paused in strange postures until she called out, "Tableau vivant," and I could again move. All this to show the musical undulation of my hips, my grace, and my patience, which was to mean that it is my nature to please, and that I could, if so desired, pose still as a statue for hours, a glass or a pair of boots propped upon my back. And then, in my borrowed gown, I went upstairs with the highest bidder. He did not know to call me Ophelia. Storyville Diary. Naming. En route, October 1910. I cannot now remember the first word I learned to write. Perhaps it was my name, Ophelia, in tentative strokes, a banner slanting across my tablet at school or inside the cover of some treasured book. Leaving my home today, I feel even more the need for some new words to mark this journey, like the naming of a child, queen, lovely, hope, marking even the humblest beginnings in the shanties. My own name was a chant over the washboard, a song to guide me into sleep. Once my mother pushed me toward a white man in our front room. "Your father," she whispered, "he's the one that named you, girl." Father, February 1911. There is but little I recall of him, how I feared his visits, though he would bring gifts, apples, candy, a toothbrush, and powder. In exchange, I must present fingernails and ears, open my mouth to show the teeth. Then I'd recite my lessons, my voice low. I would stumble over a simple word, say lay for lie, and he would stop me there. How I wanted him to like me, think me smart, a delicate colored girl, not the wild pickaninny roaming the fields barefoot. I search now for his face among the men I pass in the streets, fear the day a man enters my room, both customer and father. Belloc, April 1911. There comes a quiet man now to my room, Papa Belloc, his camera on his back. He wants nothing, he says, but to take me as I would arrange myself, fully clothed, a brooch at my throat, my white hat angled just so, or not, the smooth map of my flesh awash in afternoon light. In my room, everything's a prop for his composition, brass spittoon in the corner, the silver mirror, brush, and comb of my toilette. I try to pose as I think he would like, shy at first, then bolder. I'm not so foolish that I don't know this photograph we make will bear the stamp of his name, not mine. Blue Book, June 1911. I wear my best gown for the picture, white silk with seed pearls and ostrich feathers, my hair in a loose chignon. Behind me, Belloc's black scrim just covers the laundry, tea towels bleached and frayed, drying on the line. I look away from his lens to appear demure, to attract those guests not wanting the lewd sights of Emma Johnson's circus. Countess writes my description for the book. Violet, a fair-skinned beauty, recites poetry and soliloquies. Nightly she performs her tableau vivant, becomes a living statue, an object of art, and I fade again into someone I'm not. Portrait number 1, July 1911. Here I am to look casual, even frowsy, though still queen of my boudoir, a moment caught as if by accident, pictures crooked on the walls, newspaper sprawled on the dresser, a bit of pale silk spilling from a drawer, and my slip pulled below my white shoulders, décolleté, black stockings, legs crossed easy as a man's, all of it contrived, except for the way the flowered walls dominate the backdrop and close in on me as I pose, my hand at rest on my knee, a single finger raised, arching toward the camera, a gesture before speech, before the first word comes out. Portrait number 2, August 1911. I pose nude for this photograph, awkward, one arm folded behind my back, the other limp at my side. Seated, I raise my chin, my back so straight, I imagine the bones separating in my spine, my neck lengthening like evening shadow. When I see this plate, I try to recall what I was thinking, how not to be exposed, though naked, how to wear skin like a garment, seamless. Belloc thinks I'm right for the camera, keeps coming to my room. These plates are fragile, he says, showing me how easy it is to shatter this image of myself, how a quick scratch carves a scar across my chest. Photography, October 1911. Belloc talks to me about light, shows me how to use shadow, how to fill the frame with objects, their intricate positions. I thrill to the magic of it, silver crystals like constellations of stars arranging on film. In the negative, the whole world reverses. My black dress turned white, my skin blackened to pitch. Inside out, I said, thinking of what I've tried to hide. I follow him now, watch him take pictures. I look at what he can see through his lens and what he cannot. Silverfish behind the walls, the yellow tint of a faded bruise, other things here, what the camera misses. Disclosure, January 1912. When Belloc doesn't like a photograph, he scratches across the plate, but I know other ways to obscure a face, paint it with rouge and powder, shades lighter than skin, don a black velvet mask. I've learned to keep my face behind the camera, my lens aimed at a dream of my own making. What power I find in transforming what is real, a room flushed with light, calculated disarray. Today, I tried to capture a red bird perched on the tall hedge. As my shutter fell, he lifted in flight, a vivid blur above the clutter just beyond the hedge. Garbage, rats licking the insides of broken eggs. Spectrum, February 1912. No sun and the city's a dull palette of gray. weathered ships docked at the quay, rats dozing in the hull, drizzle slicking dark stones of the streets. Mornings such as these, I walk among the weary, their eyes sunken as if each body, diseased and dying, would pull itself inside, back to the shining center. In the cemetery, all the rest, their resolute bones stacked against the pull of the gulf. Here, another world teems, flies buzzing the meat stand, cockroaches crisscrossing the banquette, the curve and flecks of larvae in the cisterns, and mosquitoes skimming flat water like skaters on a frozen pond. Self-portrait, March 1912. On the crowded street, I want to stop time, hold it captive in my dark chamber, a train's sluggish pull out of the station, passengers waving through open windows, the dull faces of those left on the platform. Once I boarded a train. Leaving my home, I watched the red sky, the low sun glowing, an ember I could blow into flame, night falling, and my past darkening behind me. Now I wait for a departure, the whistle's shrill calling. The first time I tried this shot, I thought of my mother shrinking against the horizon. So distracted, I looked into a capped lens, saw only my own clear eye. Thank you guys for bearing with me. I realize now that when you listen to a lot of my poems, there are a lot of sequences. That means, that must be what fiction writers feel like, though, right? You know, if you just keep going for a long time without a break in between. Of course, you know, someone like Tony Early is hilarious, so you get to laugh in between. I'm kind of a drag, so you just got to stay with me and hope for levity at some point. I'm going to read a little bit from Thrall now, my most recent collection. This is a collection of poems that is dedicated to my father. Unlike my first book, which was for my father, this is to my father, who was also a poet, and encouraged me from an early age to be a poet as well. I think he was excited and anticipated. He had no idea that because he'd been writing about me all those years that I would start writing about him, and thus set the story straight. But one of the things I've said, this is a difficult book, it's a difficult subject. I'm interested in ideas about deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference across time and space. A lot of the language that came to us codified, believe it or not, during the Enlightenment. So in many ways, this is a very public, very private conversation that I'm having with my father, but in a very public forum, and in the only language I think my father would really listen to. This next poem, I should say that the book begins with two epigraphs, one by Robert Penn Warren and the other T.S. Eliot, that I see in conversation with each other. The first reads, well, I just lost it. Usually I just recite it, but I'm going to read it to you. What is love? One name for it is knowledge. After such knowledge, what forgiveness? This is a poem that uses a line from a poem of my father's. My father and I, at some point, used to read together. We'd often stand at a podium like this and go back and forth because our poems spoke to each other. And there was always a moment in this particular lovely poem of his called Her Swing that he'd get to, and I couldn't help feeling strange. It took me 40 years to figure out what it was, but there's a line in his poem that he would get to, and I'd always feel as if I were the Venus Hottentot on display. The poem is after a chalk drawing by J.H. Hasselhorst, 1864. Knowledge. Whoever she was, she comes to us like this, lips parted, long hair spilling from the table like water from a pitcher, nipples drawn out for inspection. Perhaps to foreshadow the object she'll become, a skeleton on a pedestal, a row of skulls on a shelf. To make a study of the ideal female body, 4 men gather around her. She is young and beautiful and drowned, a Venus de Medici risen from the sea, sleeping. As if we could mistake this work for sacrilege, the artist entombs her body in a pyramid of light, a temple of science over which the anatomist presides. In the service of beauty, to know it, he lifts a flap of skin beneath her breast as one might draw back a sheet. We will not see his step-by-step parsing, a translation, Mary or Catherine or Elizabeth, to corpus, areola, vulva. In his hands, instruments of the empirical, scalpel, pincers, cold as the room must be cold, all the men in coats trimmed in velvet or fur, soft as the down of her pubis. Now one man is smoking. Another tilts his head to get a better look. Yet another, at the head of the table, peers down as if enthralled, his fist on a stack of books. In the drawing, this is only the first cut, a delicate wounding, and yet how easily the anatomist's blade opens a place in me, like a curtain drawn upon a room in which each learned man is my father. And I hear again his words. I study my crossbreed child. Misnomer and taxonomy, the language of zoology. Here he is all of them, the preoccupied man, an artist, collector of experience, the skeptic angling his head, his thoughts tilting toward what I cannot know, the marshaller of knowledge, knuckling down a stack of books, even the dissector, his scalpel in hand like a pen poised above me, aimed straight for my heart. Thanks. I bet you didn't expect to hear pubis and nipples twice in one reading, right? I don't usually read these poems together, so it's a little bit of excess, I guess. When I started writing this book, the thing I was interested in, and the poet Mark Doty says our metaphors go on ahead of us, and this is always true for me, and I love that because poems are smarter than we are, and it's our job to catch up to the metaphors that our own images are creating for us. I got interested in the Mexican casta paintings, and these are paintings in colonial Mexico across the 18th century that represent the mixed blood unions that were taking place in the colony. They were always done in series of 16. They began with the white Spaniard father, and you got to see all the different blood mixtures and the offspring they would have produced. What was also interesting to me about these paintings is language, is that the taxonomies created to name these different gradations of mixed blood were also written right there on the painting. Another thing about them that was interesting to me is some of the ideas that stay with us today, and that is that they believed that across a few generations of mixing, indigenous blood, Indian blood, could be purified to whiteness, but that the taint of African blood was irreversible. So you got names like mulatto returning backwards, hold yourself in midair, and I don't understand you. If you were born in mixed blood, your taxonomy, your name was recorded in the book of castas at birth, and you were held in thrall to that definition. This is after a series by Juan Rodriguez Juarez, circa 1715. Taxonomy. 1. De Español y de India produce mestizo. The canvas is a leaden sky behind them, heavy with words, gold letters inscribing an equation of blood. This plus this equals this, as if a contract with nature or a museum label, ethnographic, precise. See how the father's hand, beneath its crown of lace, curls around his daughter's head. She's nearly fair as he is. Calidad, see it in the brooch at her collar, the lace framing her face. An infant, she is borne over the servant's left shoulder, bound to him by a sling, the plain blue cloth knotted at his throat. If the father, his hand on her skull, divines, as the physiognomist does, the mysteries of her character, discursive, legible on her light flesh, in the soft curl of her hair, we cannot know it, so gentle the eye he turns toward her. The mother, glancing sideways toward him, the scarf on her head, white as his face, his powdered wig, gestures with one hand a shape like the letter C. See, she seems to say, what we have made. The servant, still a child, cranes his neck, turns his face up toward all of them. He is dark as history, origin of the word native, the weight of blood, a pale mistress on his back, heavier every year. 2. De Español y Negra produce mulatto. Still, the centuries have not dulled the sullenness of the child's expression. If there is light inside him, it does not shine through the paint that holds his face in profile, his domed forehead, eyes nearly closed beneath a heavy brow. Though inside, the boy's father stands in his cloak and hat. It's as if he's just come in, or that he's leaving. We see him transient, rolling a cigarette, myopic, his eyelids drawn against the child passing before him. At the stove, the boy's mother contorts, watchful, her neck twisting on its spine, red beads yoked at her throat like a necklace of blood, her face so black she nearly disappears into the canvas, the dark wall upon which we see the words that name them. What should we make of any of this? Remove the words above their heads, put something else in place of the child, a table, perhaps, upon which the man might set his hat, or a dog upon which to bestow the blessing of his touch, and the story changes. The boy is a palimpsest of paint, layers of color, history rendering him that precise shade of in-between. Before this, he was nothing, blank canvas, before image or word, before a last brushstroke fixed him in his place. 3. De Español y Mestiza produce Castiza. How not to see in this gesture the mind of the colony? In the mother's arms, the child hinged at her womb, dark cradle of mixed blood, call it Mexico, turns toward the father, reaching to him as if back to Spain, to the promise of blood alchemy, 3 easy steps to purity. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. From a mestizo and a Spaniard, a castizo. From a castizo and a Spaniard, a Spaniard. We see her here, 1 generation away, nearly slipping her mother's careful grip. 4. The Book of Castas. Call it the Catalogue of Mixed Bloods, or the Book of Naught, not Spanish, not white, but mulatto returning backwards, or hold yourself in midair, and the Morisca, the Lobo, the Chino, Sambo, Albino, and the No te entiendo, the I don't understand you. Guidebook to the colony, record of each crossed birth. It is the typology of taint, of stain, blemish, sullying spot, that which can be purified, that which cannot, Canaan's black fate. How like a dirty joke it seems. What do you call that space between the dark geographies of sex? Call it the taint, as in it taint one and it taint the other. Illicit and yet naming still what is between. Between her parents, the child, mulatto returning backwards, cannot slip their hold. The triptych their bodies make, in paint, in blood, her name, written down in the book of castas, all her kind, in thrall to a word. This is my response to the help. It's after a photograph from the series The Americans by Robert Frank. Help, 1968. When I see Frank's photograph of a white infant in the dark arms of a woman who must be the maid, I think of my mother and the year we spent alone, my father at sea. The woman stands in profile back against a wall, holding her charge, their faces side by side, the look on the child's face strangely prescient, a tiny furrow in the space between her brows. Neither of them looks toward the camera, nor do they look at each other. That year, when my mother took me for walks, she was mistaken again and again for my maid. Years later, she told me she'd say I was her daughter, and each time strangers would stare in disbelief, then empty the change from their pockets. Now I think of the betrayals of flesh, how she must have tried to make of her face an inscrutable mask and hold it there as they made their small offerings, pressing coins into my hands. How like the woman in the photograph she must have seemed, carrying me each day, white in her arms, as if she were a prop, a black backdrop, the dark foil in this American story. I'm just going to read a couple more poems. I promise you that this will be my last sequence that I will read to you. But I think I should read it because this is a book that has a lot of parsing in it. Parsing of language, the way people are parsed in language, but also, as in the poem Knowledge, some actual, autopsies, dissections, that kind of parsing as well. This is a poem that considers both at the same time. And it comes out of about a 12th century miracle, the miracle of the brothers, the saints Cosmas and Damian, who were the patron saints of medicine, it's the miracle of the black leg. And these brothers, the patron saints of medicine, Cosmas and Damian, were supposed to have performed a miracle transplant. They were told by an angel in the narratives that begin in the 12th century that there is a white patient who has a diseased leg, and they're supposed to take it off and replace it with the leg, and they're told to get a leg from a black man. And so always the donor is the donor, I say, is a black man. What's interesting also about these paintings is that it began as a narrative. So in Greek, there's a Scottish poem, I think as late as the 17th century. The pictorial versions of this miracle start happening in about the 14th century, and you can find them in many different countries. And in some of them, you see the saints being given a kind of divine inspiration, so they're not using any kind of medical instruments. They're only attaching the leg with their hands, and there's angels standing around in the background. Later on, you see them as they're becoming doctors, and the idea about medicine is changing across the centuries, and the practice of medicine. So you see them instead with actual medical instruments performing these transplants. Sometimes you even see them in the graveyard with a hacksaw desecrating graves. Miracle of the black leg. Always the dark body hewn asunder. Always one man is healed, his sick limb replaced, placed in the other man's grave. The white leg buried beside the corpse, or attached as if it were always there. If not for the dark appendage, you might miss the story beneath this story. What remains each time the myth changes. How, in one version, the doctors harvest the leg from a man 4 days dead in his tomb at the church of a martyr. Or, in another, desecrate a body fresh in the graveyard at St. Peter in chains. There was buried just today an Ethiopian. Even now, it stays with us. When we mean to uncover the truth, we dig, say, unearth. Emblematic in paint, a signifier of the body's lacuna, the black leg is at once a grafted narrative, a redacted line of text, and in this scene, a dark stocking pulled above the knee. Here the patient is sleeping, his head at rest in his hand. Beatific, he looks as if he'll wake from a dream. On the floor beside the bed, a dead Moor. Hands crossed at the groin, the swapped limb white and rotting, fused in place. And in the corner, a question, poised as if to speak the syntax of sloughing a snake's curved form. It emerges from the mouth of a boy like a tongue, slippery and rooted in the body as knowledge. For centuries, this is how the myth repeats. The miracle in words or wood or paint is a record of thought. See how the story changes. In one painting, the Ethiop is merely a body, featureless in a coffin, so black he has no face. In another, the patient at the top of the frame seems to writhe in pain, the black leg grafted to his thigh. Below him, a mirror of suffering, the blackamoor, his body a fragment, arched across the doctor's lap as if dying from his wound. If not imminence, the soul's bright anchor, blood passed from one to the other, what knowledge haunts each body, what history, what phantom ache? One man always low in a grave or on the ground, the other up high, closer to heaven. One man always diseased, the other a body in service, plundered. Both men are alive in Violdo's carving. In twinned relief, they hold the same posture, the same pained face, each man reaching to touch his left leg. The black man on the floor holds his stump. Above him, the doctor restrains the patient's arm as if to prevent him touching the dark amendment of flesh. How not to see it? The men bound one to the other, symbiotic, one man rendered expendable, the other worthy of this sacrifice. In version after version, even when the Ethiopian isn't there, the leg is a stand-in, a black modifier against the white body, a piece cut off, as in the origin of the word comma, caesura in a story that's still being written. So I'm sure you know that it was perhaps Thomas Jefferson that first called for, in Notes on the State of Virginia, a kind of comparative anatomy. He believed that if you cut the Negro open, you would find the root of what Jefferson believed to be Negro innate inferiority. And there were some doctors that did this kind of work. This is Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright on dissecting the white Negro, 1851. To strip from the flesh the specious skin, to weigh in the brain pan seeds of white pepper, to find in the body its own diminishment, blood deep and definite, to measure the heft of lack, to make of the work of faith the work of science, evidence the word of God, Canaan be the servant of servants, thus to know the truth of this derelict corpus, a dark compendium, this atavistic assemblage, flatter feet, bowed legs, a shorter neck, so deep the tincture. See it? We still know white from not. Two last poems. Elegy for my father. I think by now the river must be thick with salmon. Late August, I imagine it as it was that morning. Drizzle needling the surface, mist at the banks like a net settling around us, everything damp and shining. That morning, awkward and heavy in our hip waders, we stalked into the current and found our places, you upstream a few yards and out far deeper. You must remember how the river seeped in over your boots and you grew heavier with that defeat. All day I kept turning to watch you, how first you mimed our guide's casting, then cast your invisible line, slicing the sky between us. And later, rod in hand, how you tried again and again to find that perfect arc, flight of an insect skimming the river's surface. Perhaps you recall I cast my line and reeled in 2 small trout we could not keep. Because I had to release them, I confess I thought about the past, working the hooks loose, the fish writhing in my hands, each one slipping away before I could let go. I can tell you now that I tried to take it all in, record it for an elegy I'd write one day when the time came. Your daughter, I was that ruthless. What does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? You kept casting your line, and when it did not come back empty, it was tangled with mine. Some nights, dreaming, I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed. And this last poem is the last poem I wrote for this book. And I knew I had to write it in order to finish the book. About 25 years ago, my father took me to Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, for the first time. And I had to take him back there in order to write this poem. A lot of things have changed in those 25 years, so if you haven't been recently, you might not know that now that it is actually the official position of the Jefferson Foundation that Thomas Jefferson fathered several of Sally Hemings' children, the docents will now tell you this when you take the tour, whereas it used to be kind of taboo even to bring it up. Because it is now part of the official narrative, the other kinds of conversations that you might overhear at Monticello have changed. For example, my father and I heard people asking, as if it mattered, how much white blood Sally Hemings had. Enlightenment. In the portrait of Jefferson that hangs at Monticello, he is rendered two-toned, his forehead white with illumination, a lit bulb, the rest of his face in shadow, darkened as if the artist meant to contrast his bright knowledge, its dark subtext. By 1805, when Jefferson sat for the portrait, he was already linked to an affair with his slave. Against a backdrop blue and ethereal, a wash of paint that seems to hold him in relief, Jefferson gazes out across the centuries, his lips fixed as if he's just uttered some final word. The first time I saw the painting, I listened as my father explained the contradictions, how Jefferson hated slavery, though out of necessity, my father said, had to own slaves. That his moral philosophy meant he could not have fathered those children, would have been impossible, my father said. For years we debated the distance between word and deed. I'd follow my father from book to book, gathering citations, listen as he named, like a field guide to Virginia, each flower and tree and bird, as if to prove a man's pursuit of knowledge is greater than his shortcomings, the limits of his vision. I did not know then the subtext of our story, that my father could imagine Jefferson's words made flesh in my flesh, the improvement of the blacks in body and mind in the first instance of their mixture with the whites, or that my father could believe he'd made me better. When I think of this now, I see how the past holds us captive, its beautiful ruin etched on the mind's eye. My young father, a rough outline of the old man he's become, needing to show me the better measure of his heart, an equation writ large at Monticello. That was years ago. Now we take in how much has changed. Talk of Sally Hemings, someone asking, how white was she? Parsing the fractions as if to name what made her worthy of Jefferson's attentions, a near-white quadroon mistress, not a plain black slave. Imagine stepping back into the past, our guide tells us then, and I can't resist whispering to my father, this is where we split up. I'll head around to the back. When he laughs, I know he's grateful I've made a joke of it, this history that links us, white father, black daughter, even as it renders us other to each other. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's right at, well, I call it reception time. I don't know if there's wine out there, but anyway, I'm happy to take a few questions if any of you have them. Oh, thank you, sir. Kind sir.
Earlier on you mentioned something like, I don't know if I'm going to repeat this properly, but our poems are smarter than we are. It's our job to catch up to the metaphors. Our poems are creating for us.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. That was such a good question that we should have given a mic, so we'll do that next time. He was just asking me to talk about the moment that I said that our poems are smarter than we are, and that we just need to catch up with the metaphors that the images are suggesting to us. I mentioned Mark Doty when I said that he says our metaphors go on ahead of us, and he has a really great essay that you could look at. It's about a poem called A Display of Mackerel. And it's in, I read it first in a book called Introspections, 20th century poets on one of their own poems. But one of the things he talks about is that, you know, when he's struck by an image, and in this case it was just a display of fish on ice in the grocery store, he doesn't know why he's drawn to it. But when he sits down to write about it, he just does a kind of describing of what he saw. And he tries to describe it as concretely as possible and as objectively as possible before he allows himself to make figurative comparisons. So a few sort of things literally about what he sees, about the fish on ice and how they're laid out, before he says like or as, before he allows for something figurative. And it's that moment where you begin to make, when you compare it to something else, that your mind starts to work and it begins to suggest to you something about the emotional level beneath it, something about why you see the thing the way that you do. And that's when we get to a kind of insight. I often don't know how I feel about something until I've seen what I've said. I mean, somebody said that, but you know, I'm just using it again. But it is true that when I start writing about a painting, I'm drawn to it for some reason. And it's clear that I would obviously be drawn to some of the Costa paintings because they represented mixed blood families. That's kind of obvious. I came from a mixed family, so I'd be interested in it on a surface level for that reason. But not until I begin to describe the paintings do you see what else is going on. You might look at those same paintings and not see the father in it as turning away, or not see the father as myopic. I didn't know I felt that until I wrote that, because that's what those images said to me. And so I learned something about how I felt about, you know, my own personal history by looking at the imagery and trying to describe it, and then using the metaphors and following where they led me. Does that help? Okay, good. Thank you. If anyone else has a question, I'm going to ask if someone, Alicia, would you hand them a mic? Just so that everybody else can hear the question. Oh, really? You guys only put one plant in the audience? Oh.
I was going to say, my students are over there.
I just wanted to ask if you would expand a little bit on the idea of why poetry matters. I happened to read on an airplane this morning at 6:30 a.m. Something in our magazine that you wrote about that, and I thought it was pretty powerful. So if you share that would be great.
You just kind of flashed the magazine, so that's out, huh? I didn't know that. I don't remember what I wrote, but I think I can. Well, I mean, I actually think there's countless reasons that it matters. And my second year project as Poet Laureate was an attempt to not enter the debate about whether it matters or not, but just to show that it matters and how it matters. And so, you know, what I did with correspondent Jeffrey Brown of the PBS NewsHour was to just go around to various communities across the United States to show how ordinary people were making use of poetry in their day-to-day lives. And I found there were countless places we could have gone, and we had to select just a few. We had 6 segments. But what I found again and again was that all sorts of people, all sorts of communities of people were using poetry to not only to sort of the first things we often think about, you know, to find the special language to convey our love to the beloved, or to help us celebrate weddings and births. I know there's a person in here who had poems in his wedding, Chris Coleman, wherever you are. But also they help us to grieve. You know, we also will turn to poems at funerals. We'll turn to poems when disasters strike, because we believe that they're the only language that can really speak to the depths of our emotion. But people are using poetry also to contend with what seems like the banalities of everyday life. You know, people turn to it. Well, I guess I wouldn't say that these are necessarily banalities, but you know, we visited Rafael Campo, who is a physician and also a poet at Harvard Medical School, who has a program in which he teaches the young doctors. He runs a poetry workshop because he believes that poetry helps these doctors treat the whole patient, to be more empathetic. And when I first heard that was wonderful to me. And I was at this reception in Washington D.C. where you meet all sorts, and I met another doctor, and I to try to make conversation at a cocktail party with someone you really don't want to talk to, you know how that goes. I tried to talk about this, and I happened to mention it, and he just shrugged his shoulders, and he said to me, "It's the people who can pay who get the treatment." And I thought, you're not any doctor I'd ever want to have, that there wasn't much empathy in that statement. We also visited the King County Juvenile Detention Facility in Seattle. The Pongo program uses poetry to help the juveniles who were incarcerated there contend with and articulate their own experiences. And then as part of that, we visited a homeless youth. It wasn't actually a shelter because they couldn't live there, but it was kind of a check-in space where they could go get pizza, they could rest. There were poetry workshops and readings held there. And so I met a lot of teens who had been incarcerated who were at this point homeless and were coming back to write poetry. And there was one particular young woman who I don't imagine that she knew at that moment that she was what idea she was quoting, because she probably came to it on her own, as we often do. But she said that she'd seen a lot of things. She'd led a hard life, but that writing poetry makes all of that beautiful. The language of poetry transforms the experience that she had. And all I could think of was, Shelley's words that, poetry is a mirror that makes beautiful that which is distorted. That's why poetry matters, because so much is distorted. And we need so much beauty to contend with it.
I noticed that you wrote in this book, "To My Father," and I'm really curious. I know that a lot of the poems touch upon your relationship with your father, and I'm curious to know what his response was, and if you had any particularly interesting discussions with him after this came out, and if you shared it with him, and what that conversation was like.
Yeah, thanks. So it was a really hard book for my father. And I knew that it would be. He saw a few of the poems before they came out in the book because he would see them in magazines. And so I think he was anticipating the difficulty that it might be. When he first read it, I had it because it was in galleys, and he sat down and read it, and when he finished it, he said, "It's a beautiful book, but it's sad." And I said, "Well, it was sad when I was living it." And I knew that it would be difficult for him, and so when I was named Poet Laureate, and the book was just coming out, I had to give my opening reading at the Library of Congress, and I called my father, and I said, "I really want you to be there, but I want you to know I'm going to read this book. Can you be in the audience?" And he was there. Yeah, he was there. Maybe, how about one more then?
I suppose this kind of relates to the question you just answered, but I was wondering if you had a favorite or intended audience for the poems that you write, or if you end up writing the poems for yourself. I'm just curious, like, who comes to mind when you're writing these poems, other than perhaps your father?
Oh, I have always imagined the widest possible audience for my poems. And the way that I used to think about that when I wrote my first book is that I wanted hoity-toity poetry audiences who get really annoyed if you even explain anything before you read a poem to them. You know the types. To like and to be able to find something important in these poems. But I also wanted to be able to go in front of an audience who don't think of themselves as lovers of poetry, who might not read poetry, who may have never set a foot in a poetry reading, but find something there and think that they'll come back. I used to say I wanted to go across the street and read my poems to the ladies in my grandmother's church, and that they also could understand and enter those poems. Yeah, it's the widest possible audience.